All right, so you're interested in writing a script and you're all the way back at the beginning of the process. Where do you begin? What's the first thing that you should figure out? Well, today I want to take a second to talk about theme, if only just because, for me personally, for a long time, I really do think that I approached crafting and developing a theme with the wrong mindset. That being, that was the first thing I attempted to find. I wanted to figure out what that story was about thematically, and then move forwards from there. And if you are in that same boat, let me just right now, I'm not going to bury the lead, I'm just going to tell you right now, stop. Stop trying to, at the very beginning of that process, figure out your theme, and then lay it on top of every other element within your script. The setting, the characters, and the conflict. But first, let me just say, if you were like me, and if theme is the first thing that you feel like you really need to crack before you can move forwards on your story, let me just say, I get it. I think a lot of us filmmakers watch other films and walk away from them moved because there was a powerful theme and idea presented within them. Sometimes you're gonna feel sad, and that's okay. Your future is what you make it. We are not meant to play God. Fear can be transformed into strength. With great power comes great responsibility. And after watching those films and encountering those themes, I think a lot of us go, yes, I want to move an audience in the same way that I was moved by that story. So we seek, we look, we dig, we develop, and find this gem of a theme. And we feel so proud, and indeed we should feel so proud. This is an important message that I'm going to communicate to the world. Okay, now let me find some characters, let me find a setting, let me find a conflict that can communicate that idea. But unfortunately, I think in starting that way, we oftentimes do a great disservice, not only to the characters, to the conflict, and to the setting, but to the theme itself and the way in which that theme is being communicated to the audience. Instead, I would highly encourage you, initially, all the way back at the very beginning of the process, even if you've found a theme, to set it aside. Set it aside, put it on the shelf. It's not going anywhere. It's not going to run away. It's always there for you to return to. But initially, set that thing aside and just focus on the core elements of your story. Namely, the characters and the central conflict. Who are your characters? What do they want? What stands in their way? And ultimately, how are they able to push through those obstacles to arrive at the conclusion of your film? Start there. Find characters and a conflict that are so compelling and so interesting that you cannot wait but to write that story. And when you pitch the concept to your friends and to your collaborators, they too lean in, waiting with bated breath for you to get to the end of that conflict and bring about the resolution to your story. But why? Why start there? Why start with the characters and the conflict and then return to the theme? Well, unfortunately, if you do start there, and I have experienced this personally, as many of my friends who have read my scripts can attest, your characters suddenly begin to feel quite contrived. They feel two-dimensional. They are but a mouthpiece for an idea rather than living, breathing humans that feel authentic. And your conflict will begin to run the risk of perhaps making less sense or being that much less compelling, if only just because your primary aim is not to make it realistic and compelling, but for it to say something about this theme that you want to say. And it begins to feel preachy and contrived and uninteresting. I'm a professor, and actually the way in which I begin a semester's class is not all that dissimilar to what I'm describing right now. I can very easily come into a class having not met the students, having never looked into their eyes and heard what they're interested in and what they're about. I can easily walk into the class at the beginning of a semester with a vision, with a plan. This is what we are going to do this semester. And I can tell you right now, if that's how I come into a class, more often than not, it's going to take much longer to bring the rest of the students into that vision, into that idea, into that theme. Whereas if I walk in open and receptive, ready to listen to these students, ready to look into their eyes and ask them, what are your hopes? What are your dreams? What conflicts reside within you? What are you hoping to accomplish within this class? And then figure out what those hopes, those dreams, and those aspirations mean to this central theme that I have landed on, my vision for that class. And how can those two things be reconciled and ultimately work together to a greater end? I am the professor, yes, and to a certain degree I dictate where we're ultimately going to go throughout the semester. And you, the screenwriter, are the author of these characters and this conflict. And to a degree, you do guide and direct where they ultimately progress to by the end of that story. But you also need to listen to those characters in the same way that I listen to my students. Listen to them as they begin to develop on the page, as they begin to develop in your mind. What are their hopes and dreams? What are their eccentricities? What things are they terrified of? What things are they running away from? What things are they angry about? You really do need to listen to them as they develop on the page, lest they become two-dimensional and simply a mouthpiece for this brilliant idea that you want to scream out to the audience. And again, it took me a long time to come around to this perspective, but I can tell you right now it has helped so much in developing compelling and interesting conflicts and characters, and that much more memorable and impactful themes. I love what writer-director Paul Thomas Anderson has to say on the subject when he said, "Often, I figure out the theme much later. I have to get the plot, characters, and lots of other stuff down before I can see what it really means. When starting out, just let yourself be open to where it will take you." Another reason to hold off on finding and developing your theme all the way back at the beginning of the process is your theme, which another way to describe theme is the argument that your film is trying to make. Back at the beginning of the process, that argument is not yet an argument. It's a theory. It's your theory on how the world should work. And the argument is the story itself. The argument is the story itself. That is the argument, and you cannot bring the audience to the conclusion that you have arrived at in your mind until you have worked through that story. That is the power of stories. How many times have you gone to a lecture, listened to a podcast, heard a sermon, and the first thing that that person does up there is tell a story? Why? Because ultimately, by the end of that lecture, by the end of that podcast, by the end of that sermon, they're going to try to bring you to a conclusion. But the way that they bring you there is they tell you a story. They begin to make their argument by drawing you into a story. So you, as a filmmaker, as a screenwriter, very much need to do the same thing. If you want your theme, your message, your argument to be as powerful as all those other ones I listed just a moment ago, you need to consider and craft first the story, the vehicle through which that theme will be communicated. So, at the start of the process, hold off on finding and developing that theme. But not forever. I actually left that part of that Paul Thomas Anderson quote, that being, you can always go back to the theme and layer it in. If you're a writer and director, knowing your theme won't just inform what you put down on the page, the character arcs, the setting, the central conflict. It will also very much inform every other decision that you make when you're on set during production as well as during the post-production process. What's the best way to frame and light the scene? What colors best evoke that idea? What other production design choices better reinforce what this story is about at its core? I love this quote from Sidney Lumet, and I will frequently say it to my college students in all of my classes, that being, the what will indeed inform the how. What your film is about, its theme, will inform how you go about creating and crafting that world. Theme is in fact the anchor for your entire story. So, for my first feature film, Do No Harm, after crafting the central conflict and each of the characters found within that story, I realized that the idea, the message, the theme that was wanting to bubble out of that story was that we all make mistakes and we all need grace. So after settling on that theme, I as a director began to spend a lot of time free associating about the mistakes that I had made in my past. What did those mistakes feel like? What do they look like? What do they sound like? And I trusted that the more personal my answers were, the more they moved me, the higher chance they would be personal and moving to someone else as well. And one of the ideas that I settled on after uncovering that central theme was that concealing a mistake so often drives me inwards. So much of this film is extremely subjective. The lighting, the camera work, the sound design, and the music in quite expressionistic ways, illuminating how in his own mind our main character is increasingly becoming, the more that he attempts to conceal the mistake he's made. Now that I've mentioned my main character though, and the specific conclusion that he arrives at having worked through the argument of this film, I think it's really important to also assess Is the argument a fair argument? Are you really challenging it over the course of your film? Are there other perspectives and voices that you're allowing to be raised that are actually compelling and not just the straw man version of those alternative perspectives? So while the main character on this film ultimately arrives at the conclusion that the only answer to the mistake that he's made is grace, nearly every other character was crafted and designed to combat that, to attempt to poke holes in that conclusion. And ultimately, hopefully, the conclusion then feels that much more earned and that much more valid when we arrive to it. So some characters quite passionately argue that the only way to handle a mistake is to hide it, while other characters contend that the only way to handle a mistake is to deny it and lie about it, while still other characters say the only way to handle a mistake is to embrace it and simply say, "This is my identity now, deal with it." There is indeed a lot more that I could say about theme, how to present it through the characters, the dialogue, through the particular setting, the time and place of your film, how you can utilize motifs and symbols to present it. But right now, I think the primary thing to think about is everything else around your story, especially back at the beginning of the process. Think about the central conflict, think about your characters, their desires, the obstacles, how they arrive at the conclusion that they arrive at, and then, through that, see what theme, what main idea, what argument is bubbling up through those elements. That ultimately, I think, will set you up for a greater degree of success with your script and with your film. All right, hopefully there was a thing or two that was helpful in there. As always, my friends, life is happening right now, so live it. Cheers.